Every night of the full moon, the princess would grow wolf fur. The emperor deemed her a demon and cast her into the cold palace to fend for herself. Outside, the snow was falling heavily. To keep warm, the princess had to rub melted snow all over her body to generate heat. Miraculously, all the wolf fur fell off. Yet, the emperor still believed she was a monster. He even ordered her to be knocked unconscious and sent to the grasslands for a political marriage with the Khan. But the princess, refusing to be humiliated, rammed her head against the carriage railing and died. That was when my 21st century soul transmigrated into her body. Before long, I woke up with a jolt from the violent jolting. Looking around, I found myself lying inside a carriage, and on my body, I wore a simple robe embroidered with a golden phoenix. Holding my throbbing forehead, my mind was filled with questions. Wasn't I skiing on Mount Juyao? How did I wake up on a completely different set? Just then, I noticed a young girl dressed as a palace maid, kneeling by the bed, crying and calling me princess.
Princess, you're finally awake. Chu was scared to death.
I froze on the spot, staring blankly at the unfamiliar face in the bronze mirror, realizing that I might have transmigrated. Just then, Chu approached with jewelry and ornaments.
Princess, we are only 3 days away from Jere County for the wedding. Let me dress you up now.
Hearing this, I felt as if struck by lightning. Not only did I transmigrate, but I also got the hardest mode, a political marriage alliance. Unwilling to accept reality, I went back to bed, clinging to one last hope. I covered my head with the blanket, hoping to wake up back in the modern world. But because my body was too weak, I actually suffocated myself into a faint. When I woke up again, Chu was kneeling on the floor, weeping loudly, and the voice of the accompanying imperial physician came from outside the carriage.
The princess's pulse was originally as thin as a thread, yet she has miraculously turned the corner. This is truly an auspicious sign. Looking at it this way, she will definitely last until the marriage alliance is completed.
I waved my hand to dismiss him and then closed my eyes, my heart as cold as ashes. Suddenly, another matter crossed my mind, so I quickly patted the bed. System? Where is the system? I frantically called out for the system in my mind. However, the air was terrifyingly quiet, without even a single prompt sound. I opened my eyes in despair, only to find Cher looking at me, on the verge of tears. Driven by the desire to survive, I secretly made up my mind. Instead of sitting and waiting for our doom, it would be better to figure out my current situation. I simply sat up, cross-legged, and met her gaze. What dynasty is this? Which country's princess am I? And who is my husband? To my surprise, Cher was completely dumbfounded after hearing this. She looked at me as if looking at a lunatic, clearly thinking that I had lost my mind. Seeing her starting to shed tears again, I realized I had asked too bluntly, so I quickly took her hand, and after a bout of coaxing and trickery, I finally got a grasp of the details. I am Chu Yue, the 5th princess of the Southern Kingdom. My husband is Helian Lie, the new Khan who unified the 6 tribes of the Grassland. As for my status as a princess, it was merely a temporary title bestowed for the sake of this marriage alliance. I was so furious upon hearing this that I nearly died on the spot. They ignored me in normal times, yet pushed me out to take the hit when the country was in trouble. A total tool, indeed. I clenched my fists, frantically searching my mind for historical knowledge, only to find that this dynasty did not exist at all. I let out a helpless sigh. No system, no omniscience. And on top of that, I'm a sickly weakling. This is a hell mode start. I wanted to get off the carriage to clear my head, but as soon as I stepped down, I started panting heavily. And so, I immediately abandoned any thoughts of jumping out of the window to escape. Cher helped me over to the bronze mirror to do my makeup and hair, adorning my head with jewelry. Previously, the original owner of this body had been bedridden, so the prepared jewelry and splendid attire had been of no use at all. Once my makeup and hair were finished, I moved my neck uncomfortably, feeling as though several pounds of gold were piled on my head. Cher, on the other hand, was very happy, a smile gracing her youthful face. I suddenly remembered something and looked at her in confusion. How old is Khan Helian Lie this year?
I heard the Khan is close in age to the crown prince, only 4 years older than you.
Only then did I pat my chest in relief. Thank goodness. At least I don't have to marry some old geezer. But the next second, my heart leapt back into my throat. An image of a burly, rugged man tearing apart a leg of mutton with his bare, dirty hands instantly flashed in my mind. I swallowed hard in nervousness. Meanwhile, Cher kept hyping up Khan Helian Lie, saying he was incredibly brave and had conquered the grasslands at a very young age. Being able to marry him was a blessing that countless people could only dream of. I instinctively rolled my eyes. Would you want this blessing if it were offered to you? After an internal struggle, I lowered my voice and asked her, can we choose not to go? Let's run away together quietly. To my surprise, the moment the words left my mouth, Cheer dropped to her knees with a thud, her face turning deathly pale.
Princess, this is a treasonous offense punishable by death. Please, watch your words.
I sighed helplessly and pulled her up. I was just making casual conversation. With my current physical state, where even running 50 meters is a struggle, how far could I possibly run? It would probably only lead to an even worse death. Around dusk, the carriage finally stopped to rest. I was leaning against the carriage window, half asleep, when Cheer brought a bowl of pitch black, pungent medicine and walked over to me. I gagged and pushed the medicine bowl away. This kind of concoction of unknown ingredients, I wouldn't drink it even if it killed me. Seeing that Cheer was still trying to persuade me, I quickly suggested going outside for a walk. After all, after being jolted around all this way, every bone in my body felt like it was breaking apart. But Cheer stopped me.
Princess, this is against the rules. You must not show your face before meeting the consort. Even the imperial physician can only stand outside to examine you.
I curled my lip in disgust. Ancient times sure have a lot of obnoxious rules. I had no choice but to lift the carriage curtain and gaze boredly into the distance. The grassland stretched endlessly, and the setting sun dyed the clouds a golden hue. It was beautiful, indeed, but the altitude sickness was also truly killing me. My head throbbed painfully. I wished I could conjure up an oxygen tank on the spot. I had no appetite for dinner, eating only 2 pieces of chestnut cake. The most ridiculous part was, this princess's styling was absolute torture. Doing hair and makeup morning and night took a full 8 hours. Even without stepping foot outside, I had to support several pounds of gold ornaments on my head. If not for Cheer, I probably wouldn't even know where to stick these hairpins. After suffering through half the night like this, I finally managed to sleep for 3 hours, but before dawn, I was shaken awake by Chinair.
Princess, wake up quickly. We are almost there. We mustn't lose face in front of the consort.
Rubbing my sleepy eyes, I was once again forced into that heavy getup. Meanwhile, at the city gates, a group of grassland men were gathered together in high spirits. The leader, Helian Lie, was chatting with them while glancing towards the carriage, listening to the completely foreign language outside. My heart was about to leap out of my throat. Just then, the envoy prepared to step forward to go through the formalities, only to see a young man riding a horse rushing over. With a leap, he stepped onto my carriage. The envoy was shocked and pale, hurrying to stop him, but the young man yanked open my carriage curtain. I locked eyes with him awkwardly. Perhaps because my appearance was too striking, the young man's mouth fell wide open, unable to speak for a long while. Not until Helian Lie called him displeasuredly did he reluctantly head back, still muttering under his breath.
The Southern Emperor wants to trade a princess for peace. It is absolute wishful thinking.
Helian Lie kept everyone in check.
The person has been delivered. You may go back now.
Facing the overbearing Helian Lie, the Southern envoy had no room for bargaining at all, and could only leave dejectedly. Fortunately, Cheer was allowed to stay. While I felt relieved, I couldn't help but feel a sense of despair. With only Cheer and me, how could we deal with these grassland barbarians? Before I could think of a way out, in the next second, the carriage shot forward. Like an arrow released from a bowstring, I felt as if I was about to fly, my back slamming heavily against the carriage wall. Moreover, I kept hearing the men's hearty laughter coming from the front. Only then did I realize it was actually this guy driving the carriage himself. I was shaken half to death, and the headpieces all over my head were smashed to pieces. After struggling to no avail, I had no choice but to give up and lie flat. After hurtling forward for who knows how long, the carriage finally came to a halt. Before I could even catch my breath, the curtain was roughly yanked open. Immediately after, Helian Lie, towering like a mountain, hunched over awkwardly to draw near. His gaze made me feel as if he wanted to tear me apart and swallow me alive. I sat in the corner, shivering and shaking, not even daring to breathe too loudly. "You, who are you?" He stared at me, his voice as deep as thunder.
I am your husband.
I froze on the spot, my mind completely blank except for the word husband. At that moment, Cheer's anxious calls came from outside the carriage. I barely managed to compose myself and gave a response. Only then did she hurry into the carriage, but she was so intimidated by Helian Lie's oppressive aura that she didn't dare lift her head, only curtsying deeply.
The princess's hair and makeup are completely ruined. I must tidy them up immediately.
Helian Lie glanced back at me, told Cheer to hurry up, and then turned and left. Cheer helped me up from the floor to sit before the bronze mirror. My face was pale as death, and my whole body shook uncontrollably. At the same time, the jeers and cheers outside were deafening. Everyone was curious if the southern bride was beautiful, but Helian Lie Lie's face darkened, feeling extremely displeased. To him, although I was beautiful, I was as frail as a rabbit and not worthy at all to be his princess. Before long, Cheer's nimble hands had tidied my hair, makeup, and wedding gown. She carefully helped me step down from the carriage. To my dismay, the moment I stepped down, I made a fool of myself in public. Helian Lie had only taken my hand, yet my legs went completely weak, and I fell headlong into his arms. The crowd instantly erupted into bursts of grating laughter. Some mocked me for being too eager to throw myself into his arms, while others whispered that my beauty would stir a man's blood. Yet, I could only keep my head lowered, beating my useless legs in shame and anger. But this was only the beginning of the humiliation. Immediately after, a plate of bloody plain boiled sheep's head was brought before me. Helian Lie carved off a piece of the boiled meat and handed it to me expressionlessly.
Eat it.
Suppressing the churning in my stomach, I chewed numbly like a puppet. But Helian Lie, displeased by how slowly I swallowed, gave another heavy cough. I shuddered in fear and, ignoring the nausea, forced the meat all the way down. Just then, a gentle voice broke the suffocating atmosphere.
Helian Lie, you should be gentler to your wife.
I looked up and saw that the speaker was a middle-aged woman. She warmly took my hand and introduced herself. Only then did I learn that she was Suo Lun, the wife of Helian Lie's eldest brother. Not knowing how to respond to her kindness, I could only manage a weak smile. Soon, I was sitting solemnly at the banquet beside Helian Lie again, receiving wave after wave of people kneeling in homage. The mutton I had just swallowed was churning in my stomach, yet Helian Lie only cared about drinking with the others. My face looked terrible, and I kept my head down in silence. But just then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that the youth who had lifted my carriage curtain earlier was constantly stealing glances at me. Seeing me look over, he quickly averted his gaze, though the tips of his ears flushed bright red. Before I knew it, the banquet finally came to an end. I had been forced to drink a few cups of wine, leaving my consciousness increasingly hazy. Fortunately, Cheer helped me back to the tent and assisted me in removing my makeup and going to bed. Half asleep and half awake, I sensed someone entering the tent and then walking up to my side. Thinking it was Helian Lie, my heart tightened and I struggled to get out of bed. But in the next moment, a hand actually reached under the blanket, and by the moonlight, I realized with horror that the figure was thin and gaunt, and it was not Helian Lie at all. My heart skipped a beat in sheer terror. As soon as that person's hand slipped under the covers, I felt a piercing chill. Could this prairie man have some strange habit of groping people in the middle of the night? Who is there? Don't come any closer. I grabbed the golden hairpin from under my pillow. It was the one Cheer had just taken off for me. By the faint moonlight, I saw a slightly youthful face. It was actually Aurora, the boy who had ridden the horse and lifted my curtain earlier today. It is you. What are you doing sneaking into my tent in the middle of the night? He was startled by me and quickly covered my mouth, a flash of panic crossing his eyes. Though this young man looked fierce, his palms were actually sweating.
What are you shouting for? I just came to see if the weakling sent by the Southern Emperor Suo was actually scared to death by my brother.
As he spoke, he awkwardly withdrew his hand, revealing half a piece of dry milk skin from his shirt. So it turned out this kid was just tough-talking but soft-hearted. He had secretly come to bring food because he was afraid I would starve to death.
Don't get the wrong idea. I just thought it would be bad luck if you died in this tent. You look just like a porcelain doll. I really don't know what my brother sees in you.
Just as I was about to retort, the heavy sound of leather boots suddenly came from outside the tent, accompanied by a strong smell of alcohol and the rowdy shouting of a crowd. The sound drew closer and closer, making the dust on the ground vibrate.
Quick, hide. Your brother is back.
The boy's face changed drastically, like a startled hare. He slipped into the shadows under the bed in an instant. Immediately after, the heavy leather curtain was violently pulled open, and Helian Lie walked in, swaying drunkenly.
Why aren't you asleep yet? Are you waiting for me?
His mountain-like physique pressed down on me. I curled up in the corner, feeling as if the very air had grown thin. He stared at me for a long time, then suddenly reached out and pinched my chin with astonishing force.
So fragile. You'd break with a single squeeze. Southern girl. You'd better survive for a while. Don't disappoint me.
After he finished speaking, he collapsed heavily beside me. Instantly, loud snoring filled the air. Just as I breathed a sigh of relief, I noticed a very familiar silk handkerchief hanging from his waist. It was the exact one I had lost back in the Southern Palace, and on the inner side of the handkerchief, a dark red character for kill was starkly embroidered. My heart instantly leaped into my throat. How did this end up in his hands? Did he already know that someone wanted me dead? I stared at the handkerchief embroidered with the word kill and sat awake for the entire night. The item at Helian Lie's waist was like a guillotine hanging over my head, sending a cold shiver down the back of my neck. As dawn was just breaking, the man beside me stirred, terrified. I quickly stuffed the handkerchief back into his robe and pretended to still be asleep.
Southern woman.
How long have you been staring at me? He rolled over and sat up, his eyes bright and clear, not looking like he had just woken up at all. He reached into his robe and pulled the handkerchief right out, dangling it in front of my face.
Why do you have this? Your southern envoy handed this to me personally. He said it was a sweet incentive. As long as you die of illness on the grasslands, the South is willing to send another 3,000 bolts of fine silk.
I went entirely cold, even though I had always known I was just a pawn. Hearing with my own ears that my imperial father had paid for my debt still felt like a dagger to the heart. This was no diplomatic marriage. They were sending me here to die. Helian Lie suddenly leaned over me. His rough fingers brushed against my neck. An intimate gesture, but with a hint of murderous intent. I could feel his calloused fingertips hurting my skin.
I originally planned to strangle you to death last night, but seeing how terrified and foolish you looked because of Aurora, I thought keeping you alive might be more amusing than killing you.
He laughed heartily and got up, carelessly throwing on his leather robe. I had just breathed a sigh of relief and was about to get out of bed when I noticed my fingertips had turned a bizarre, dark black. What is happening to my hands? Helian Lie's expression changed instantly. He grabbed my hand, his brow furrowing into a tight knot. I only felt the world spin around me as everything went completely black. Did I just transmigrate here? Only to bite the dust before I could even fight back. I was woken up by the pungent smell of herbal medicine. Opening my eyes, I found myself lying inside a simple tent. An old man with a white beard was pricking the web of my thumb with a bone needle. I'm not dead yet. Helian Lie stood nearby with his arms crossed, his face so dark it could drip with fury. Aurora was squatting by the entrance, pulling at his hair in frustration, completely stripped of his arrogance from last night.
Shut up. If you die, where else will I find such an amusing toy?
The old healer wiped away his sweat and babbled a string of words in the steppe language. After listening to him, the anger in Helian Lie's eyes grew even fiercer. He slammed his fist onto the table.
This kind of slow, acting poison requires a catalyst. It seems the people around you aren't clean either.
Cheer's face instantly flashed through my mind, making my heart tremble violently. Impossible. Cheer grew up with me from childhood. How could she possibly harm me? Just as I was thinking this, Cheer rushed into the tent, crying and screaming. With a thud, she fell to her knees at Helian Lie's feet, bruising her forehead from bowing repeatedly.
Mercy, Khan. The princess is truly innocent. I know nothing at all.
Helian Lie did not speak, but only stared at her coldly, looking at Chin'er's trembling shoulders. My heart was filled with mixed emotions. On this desolate grassland, whom could I possibly trust? Just then, sister-in-law Wulan walked in carrying a steaming bowl of meat broth. She gently helped me sit up and casually smoothed my messy hair.
Poor child. Have some broth first to calm your nerves. Helian Lie, stop scaring her with that grim face all day.
I took a sip of the broth, and a warmth spread through my stomach. Since the Southern Kingdom has no place for me, then I must take root here on the grassland and show them who the ultimate winner is. Helian Lie, if I can help you grow crops on the grassland, can you spare my life? Helian Lie was stunned, as if he had heard some cosmic joke, but before he could speak, the sudden sound of rapid hooves approached from outside. A soldier covered in blood rushed in and knelt directly before Helian Lie.
This is bad, Khan. The Southern diplomatic mission was ambushed on their way back. The leader was your second uncle.
My heart sank. The power struggles on this grassland were actually more brutal than those in the imperial palace. The heavy thud of hooves shattered the peace of the camp. A burly man with a fierce, fleshy face dismounted, none other than Helian Lie's second uncle, Suo Lun. He tossed aside a bloody bundle he was carrying. The official hat of a southern envoy rolled out of it.
Helian Lie, those spineless cowards from the Southern Kingdom wanted to flee, so I slaughtered them along the way.
Helian Lie shielded me, expressionless, his back standing as straight as a pine, hiding behind him. I looked at the official hat on the ground. My heart sank into my stomach. This isn't just killing envoys. This is completely cutting off my retreat and trying to drive me, a Peace Alliance princess, to my death.
I heard this woman brought poison and nearly killed you. A jinx like her is better off handed over to me to deal with, lest she ruin the fortune of our grasslands.
Suo Lun's turbid eyes stared intently at me, as if he wanted to swallow me alive. Taking a deep breath, I suppressed the fear in my heart and stepped out from behind Helian Lie, looking directly at that overbearing, arrogant man. If you kill me, uncle, it will only make it easy for them to succeed. If you kill me, it means they succeed. It is tantamount to admitting that the plot of the Southern Kingdom's traitorous officials has succeeded. Would the warriors of the grasslands willingly let themselves be used as tools by others. Everyone was taken aback. Probably no one expected that a sickly person like me, who gasped for breath after just a few steps, would dare to speak so calmly and confidently in front of the Grassland's god of war. Suo Lun's face flushed red with anger just as he was about to flare up. Helian Lie's large hand firmly pressed down on his shoulder.
Uncle, my woman is not for others to order around. Take your men. Get out.
Helian Lie's voice was not loud, yet it carried an unquestionable, commanding authority. Sauron gave me a fierce glare and left with his men, cursing all the way. Though the crisis was temporarily averted, I felt entirely drained of strength, my legs too weak to keep me standing. Just as I was about to collapse, Helian Lie extended his long arm and scooped me up directly by the waist. He looked down at me, a trace of an unreadable emotion in his eyes. Put me down. Ignoring my struggles, he strode toward the tent. Meanwhile, in the shadows far away, a pair of malevolent eyes stared fixedly at us, as if waiting for the next opportunity to strike. Since I have become Helian Lie's private property, I must show my value in order to survive, to find a way to stay alive. I took Amor and Chinner to a wasteland at the back of the camp. It was overgrown with weeds, and even looked somewhat desolate.
Chu Yue, why did you bring us here? Even sheep wouldn't want to stay in this place.
I ignored the boy's complaints, squatted down, and grabbed a handful of soil. The texture beneath my fingertips brought a surge of joy to my heart. Under this sandy layer was actually fertile black soil. I directed Chinner and Amor to dig a ditch to channel water, attempting to improve this despised piece of land. After being busy for most of the day, just as we were about to rest, a cloud of dust suddenly billowed up on the distant horizon. Immediately after, a dozen warhorses seemed to go mad, charging frantically toward us with bloodshot eyes. Not good. The horses are spooked. Run to the high ground, quick. Once a herd of horses on the grassland loses control, it is enough to trample everything. I pulled Chinner and scrambled desperately up the dirt slope, while Amor drew his short dagger and shielded us from the front. The boy's delicate face was written with a resolve to face death. Just as the leading horse was about to crash into Amor, a dark figure flashed past like lightning. Helian Lie, riding his pitch-black warhorse, charged out from an angle. His long whip lashed out like a swimming dragon, wrapping precisely around the neck of the lead horse. Exerting force in both arms, he dragged the spooked horse to a halt by sheer brute strength. As the dust settled, several horses lay twitching on the ground, foaming at the mouth. I ran over to take a closer look and found a few purple leaf fragments near the horse's mouth. Helian Lie. This was no accident. Someone put hallucinogenic heartbreak grass in the fodder. Helian Lie picked up the leaf fragment, the coldness in his eyes cold enough to freeze the air. He suddenly looked up toward the center of the camp. A strange wisp of green smoke was rising from there. That was the signal on the grasslands to launch a mutiny. It seems some people just can't wait to see my corpse. He mounted his horse and pulled me up in one swift motion. The jolting on the horse's back made it hard for me to breathe, but I knew the real battle of life and death had only just begun. The warhorse galloped, the wind howling in my ears. When Helian Lie brought me rushing back to the camp, the surroundings had already descended into utter chaos. That wisp of green smoke was indeed the signal for a mutiny. Sauron's men were surrounding the main tent, clamoring noisily.
Helian Lie. You harbor the demoness who poisoned us from the southern kingdom. You are no longer fit to be the Khan. Hand over the royal seal, and I'll give you a quick death.
Sauron raised his large blade. Backed by a crowd of defecting generals, I was held tightly in Helian Lie's protective embrace, feeling the suppressed fury in his chest. This old rogue certainly moved fast. Having just failed to poison the horse feed, he was now resorting to open robbery. Helian Lie. They outnumber us. Don't fight them head on. Helian Lie let out a cold laugh and actually dismounted directly, conveniently handing me off into Amor's arms. He walked toward Sauron, all by himself, and with every step he took, the murderous aura around him grew thicker.
What do you think you're doing? Stop right there.
Just as Sauron prepared to swing his blade, I suddenly noticed a shiny powder sticking to his stirrup. That wasn't ordinary soil. It was the alkali stone powder I had carelessly discarded earlier while conditioning the soil in the wasteland. Second, uncle, you haven't even wiped the alkali powder off your stirrups yet. Do you want to deny it now? This alkali powder is the proof. The one who went to the stables to poison the feed just now was you, wasn't it? Everyone's eyes immediately shot toward Sauron's feet. The grassland people detested underhanded acts against horse feed the most, as it was a desecration of their warhorses. Suo Lun's face instantly turned deathly pale. The blade in his hand even trembled.
Colluding with foreign enemies and harming our warhorses. Suo Lun, your death cannot expiate your crimes.
Before anyone could blink, Helian Lie moved, like lightning. Before that group of people could even react, he had already snatched Suo Lun's scimitar. The cold edge of the blade was pressed directly against the old traitor's neck. The rebels who had been clamoring just now instantly went silent. They looked at each other in dismay, and finally, one after another, threw down their weapons and knelt on the ground. I let out a long sigh of relief. Slapping them in the face with logic felt absolutely amazing.
Take him away and deal with him according to clan law.
Helian Lie turned his head to look at me, the frost in his eyes melting by half. But before a smile could form on my face, Cheer, who had been hiding behind the crowd, suddenly let out a sharp scream and collapsed limply to the ground. Her face became exactly the same color as those horses earlier. The chaos in the camp was settled, but the atmosphere inside the tent was even more suffocating than before. Cheer lay on the blanket, her breathing weak, and her fingertips had also developed that eerie, dark black color. "Doctor, how is she?" The old doctor shook his head and put down his bone needle.
This poison acts too quickly. Clearly, the toxins in Cheer's body are even deeper than yours. Princess, I'm afraid this young lady took the blow for you. This poison was likely placed on the cloth you use to wipe your face every day.
I felt as if I had been struck by lightning, so the poison wasn't in the wine, nor was it in the food, but on the object closest to me. If Chair hadn't secretly helped wash my cloth last night, the person lying here right now would be me.
Search inside and out of this tent, and dig up the ground if you have to.
With Helian Lie's command, the personal guards immediately went to work. Before long, a small wooden box that was half burnt was dug up from the dirt in the corner of the tent. Helian Lie used the tip of his blade to pry the box open. Inside was a secret letter that had not yet been completely burned. I would recognize that handwriting even if it were turned to ash. It belonged to Chu Yue, the first prince of the Southern Kingdom. A letter written by my dear older brother himself. As it turned out, he didn't just want my life. He also wanted to use my death to plunge the grasslands into civil strife so he could profit from the chaos. After reading the letter, Helian Lie casually tossed it into the brazier. He walked over to me and placed his large hand on the crown of my head. Though the gesture was rough, it carried an unprecedented sense of reassurance.
Since the Southern Kingdom does not want you, the grasslands will be your home from now on. Whoever touches you, touches me, Helian Lie.
I looked up into his deep eyes and, for the first time, thought this rugged man was actually quite handsome. Just then, the comatose Chair suddenly grabbed the corner of my clothes, mumbling a name incoherently under her breath.
Imperial physician. Imperial physician song. Run, quick. Imperial physician song.
Imperial physician song, the one who had declared on the journey to the marriage alliance that I was doomed to die. I suddenly remembered that in the entire escort party, the only person Soren hadn't killed seemed to be him. Helian Lie and I exchanged glances, both realizing that something was wrong. Just then, Amore's panicked shout came from outside the tent.
This is bad. That southern physician, along with a few guards, has fled toward the sacred spring of the base.
The sacred spring was the lifeblood of the grasslands. The spring water shimmered with a faint blue light under the moon. Imperial physician Song stood upstream, holding a white porcelain vial in his hand, his face twisted in madness.
Since this old man cannot survive, none of you on these grasslands shall live either. Once this vial of poison goes in, your sacred spring will become a dead spring.
When Helian Lie brought me to the edge of the sacred spring, this was the exact scene I witnessed. My weak and sickly body, having run those few miles, now has my lungs burning with searing pain. But I know that I must not collapse now. Stop. Imperial physician Song, do you think that by destroying this spring, the master behind you will let your family go? Imperial physician Song's hand trembled. He turned his head to look at me. He probably didn't expect that I, a princess who was supposed to die on the journey, could actually still stand here and speak.
What nonsense are you talking? The first prince promised me.
He promised to treat your family well after silencing you. Look at the engraving on the bottom of that poison bottle. That is something only used by the secret guards and death squad of the Southern Kingdom. Once you fall, this will be the ironclad proof of your absconding to avoid punishment. Taking advantage of the moment he lost his focus, Helian Lie, like a black panther that had been lying in wait, suddenly lunged forward with explosive speed. He did not use a blade, but casually threw a small stone instead, precisely striking Imperial physician Song's wrist. The white porcelain bottle fell to the ground at the sound, but it did not land in the water. Rather, it fell into the grass on the shore. Helian Lie rushed forward in one stride, his large hand directly locking onto Imperial physician Song's throat.
Daring to touch the sacred spring, I will let you know that death is sometimes a luxury.
Imperial physician Song collapsed to the ground like a lump of mud. Supporting myself with effort, I walked over, picked up the medicine bottle, and sniffed it. A pungent odor rushed straight to my brain. My heart sank. Why does this smell different from the poison Cheer took? Oh no, this bottle is not poison. It is bait. As soon as she finished speaking, from the grass all around the sacred spring, a dense rustling sound suddenly erupted. Countless brightly colored venomous snakes were rushing frantically toward the spring water. The densely packed venomous snakes flicked their tongues. The sight made my skin crawl. So Imperial Physician Song's real killing blow wasn't poisoning the water, but using snake-attracting powder to destroy the sacred spring. Once these snakes enter the water, the spring will be completely contaminated by corpse venom. Helian Lie. Quick, use fire. These things are afraid of fire. Helian Lie reacted extremely fast. He quickly tore off his leather robe, lit a torch, and brandished it by the spring. Amor also arrived with his men. The crowd formed a defensive ring with a wall of fire, but there were too many snakes. The torches couldn't hold them off for long.
The fire is about to go out. These beasts aren't afraid of death at all.
I stared at the deep blue spring water, my mind racing furiously. My modern geographical knowledge told me that such sacred springs usually have an extremely high sulfur content. I suddenly looked at the glittering minerals on the shore. Helian Lie. Smash those yellow minerals and throw them into the fire. Quick, though Helian Lie was puzzled. At this moment, he chose to trust me unconditionally. He swung his heavy sword, smashing several minerals into powder and throwing them into the fire pit. In an instant, a plume of pungent sulfur smoke billowed up. Smelling this scent, the snakes acted as if they had met their natural enemy, turning around and scattering in all directions. Within moments, the tide of snakes that had just been there completely dispersed. The crisis was averted. As my tense nerves relaxed, I fell straight backward. With a swift movement, Helian Lie caught me in his arms. His heart was beating rapidly, and his chest was incredibly hot. Helian Lie looked at the pale, yet determined woman in his arms. The disdain in his eyes had long since vanished entirely, replaced by an almost obsessive possessiveness.
Chu Yue, just how many more surprises do you have that I don't know about? Cut the nonsense. Take the moss from the bottom of the spring and go back quickly. That is Cheer's actual antidote.
After returning to the camp, after Cheer took the medicine, his face finally regained some color. As I sat by the bed, catching my breath, Helian Lie suddenly pushed the door open and came in, holding a bowl of hot milk tea in his hand. He awkwardly handed it to my lips.
Drink it. From now on in the grasslands, no one will dare call you a weakling again.
I took the milk tea, a hint of sweetness rising in my heart. But just then, a goshawk landed outside the tent, with a red declaration of war tied to its leg. The news of the Southern Kingdom's army of 100,000 pressing on the border spread like a plague. Panic rippled through the camp. Looking at that blood-red declaration of war, my heart went cold. First, Prince Chu Yue wants to step on my corpse to claim military glory.
Scared?
Helian Lie was wiping his dark iron heavy sword. The firelight reflected on his deep-set profile, revealing a reassuring fierceness. Are you afraid? Are you afraid of handing me over to them in exchange for peace? Helian Lie stopped his movements, walked up to me, and pressed his large hand against the back of my neck, forcing me to look straight into his eyes.
You are my princess. Unless I die, no one shall take you away.
My heart warmed, and I slipped a small clay jar into his hand. This was the saltpeter powder I had secretly had people refine over the past 2 days. Although it is not a lot, it can save lives at a critical moment. This can help you. Helian Lie took the clay jar, gave me a complex look, and then turned to stride out of the tent.
Send down the order. Assemble the entire army. Welcome our distinguished guests from the Southern Kingdom.
Watching his receding figure, I decided I couldn't just sit and wait for death. First, Prince Chu Yue is suspicious by nature. The Southern Kingdom's army seems powerful, but in truth, they all have their own hidden agendas. I called Amor over and had him take me to the watchtower at the highest point of the camp. I must see for myself exactly what tricks this so-called army of 100,000 is hiding.
Chu Yue, are you crazy? Stray arrows are flying everywhere out there. If anything happens to you, my brother will definitely skin me alive.
Cut the chatter. Lead the way. Standing on the high platform, I looked toward the distant enemy camp under the moonlight. As expected, the layout of the Southern Army's tents was extremely bizarre. They form a massive, faint circle, yet the center was completely empty. Chu Yue, you really are up to some underhanded tricks. As the first light of dawn broke, the two armies faced off in confrontation. The Southern Army changed its formation, and dozens of massive wooden carts were suddenly rolled out from the center. They were covered with black cloth, emitting a pungent smell of sulfur.
What are those things? They look like monsters.
Those are the Southern State's secret weapons, the fire dragons. They use the wind to spray flames. The tents and pastures of the grassland are most vulnerable vulnerable to this. Seeing the southern army begin to adjust their sails to unleash the fire with the wind, I knew once the fire started, Helian Lie's cavalry would be trapped in a sea of flames. The consequences would be unimaginable. Amur, go and collect all the bronze mirrors and anything else that reflects light in the camp. Quick. Although Amur looked completely bewildered, he still did as he was told. Before long, dozens of bronze mirrors were neatly lined up on the high platform. I adjusted their angles, using the strongest beam of the early morning sunlight to reflect it precisely onto the black cloth of the enemy's wooden carts. The blinding light pierced the enemy's eyes, and the southern soldiers instantly fell into chaos. Their precise sail adjustments were completely disrupted.
Now is the time. Attack their left flank.
On the battlefield, Helian Lie seemed to be completely in sync with me. He suddenly turned his horse around. He led his cavalry, cutting into the enemy's left flank like a black whirlwind. At the same time, I had Amur light the clay pot containing the special powder. With a loud bang, a massive plume of smoke rose from the enemy camp. Before those fire dragons could even be of any use, they were knocked to pieces by their own retreating men. In the rear, Chu Yue, the first prince of the southern kingdom, was cursing in rage. He never would have imagined that his carefully prepared ultimate weapon would be ruined by a sickly person using just a few mirrors. Helian Lie took the lead, flesh and blood flying wherever his heavy sword struck. He looked up at the watchtower, across the vast army. I saw the bright, confident smile in his eyes. We won the first clash. But before anyone could cheer, the sky suddenly darkened. A swarm of black, monstrous birds rose from behind the southern camp. It blocked out the sun. I looked closer. Those weren't birds at all. They were clearly massive, specially made southern kites. Sealed clay pots hung beneath the kites, dripping thick oil down below. At this height, our arrows couldn't reach them at all. They want to burn us alive. As soon as she finished speaking, then the first batch of oil pots smashed onto the tents, instantly sending flames leaping several meters high. The Grassland warriors fell into disarray. The horses panicked and bolted. The flames lit up half the sky, and a heat wave rushed over us, leaving me almost unable to breathe. Don't run around. Amur, have your brother's men tie the remaining saltpeter powder to their arrowheads. Shoot them toward the kites. I waved frantically from the watchtower, trying to catch Helian Lie's attention. Helian Lie looked up at me. His hawk-like eyes instantly understood my intention. He wheeled his horse around sharply, his voice booming across the battlefield like thunder.
Archers, ready, on my command. Shoot the kite's control lines.
Helian Lie drew his massive bow himself. The arrowheads were wrapped in my specially made flammable powder. With a single command from him, hundreds of arrows soared into the sky. The saltpeter powder traced dazzling streaks of fire in the air, precisely igniting the frames of the paper kites. The sky looked as if a grand meteor shower was falling. The burning black birds plummeted one after another. One of them headed straight for the southern kingdom's first prince's banner, scaring Chu Yue so much that he scrambled to hide inside the shield formation. Hoist by your own petard. Chu Yue, how does this taste? The enemy formation fell into complete chaos. Helian Lie seized the opportunity to lead his elite cavalry in a final charge. As his heavy sword swung, the southern kingdom's banner was sliced right in half. Chu Yue fled in panic with his defeated troops, vanishing into the far edge of the wasteland. Looking at the mess covering the ground, my tense nerves finally relaxed. My body, which I had been forcing to hold up, could support me no longer. My vision went black, and I tumbled straight down from the high platform. When I woke up, I found myself lying in a warm fox fur coat. The charcoal fire crackled. Helian Lie was sitting by the bedside, holding a bloody strip of cloth in his hand, his gaze terrifyingly dark. Did we win?
Go to sleep.
Helian Lie didn't speak, only roughly grabbing my hand. I looked down, and on my once fair wrist, a dark purple ring had actually appeared. It looked shockingly grotesque.
The battle is won, but you are dying. What the Southern Kingdom gave you when you married off wasn't poison. It is a slow-acting drug that drains your vital energy. You overexerted your mind these past 2 days, causing the drug to take effect early.
I felt as if I had been struck by lightning. It turned out that from the very beginning, Chu Yue never intended for me to survive this month. He sent me here just so I would die on the grasslands, to give him a perfect excuse to start a war. It seems that for a tool like me, even dying of old age is a luxury. Helian Lie stood up abruptly and pulled me into his arms with a jerk. His heartbeat was steady and powerful, carrying the dominant aura unique to a man of the grasslands.
I said you are my woman. If you want your life, I will tear down the southern treasury to get you the medicine.
He untied an exquisite bone whistle from his waist and stuffed it into my hand.
This is the token of the Grassland Khan. Seeing this whistle, is like seeing me.
Just then, Cheer's panicked cry came from outside the tent.
Consort, this is bad. The southern envoy has returned. He also brought an imperial decree, claiming they want to take the princess back to recuperate.
Helian Lie and I exchanged a look, both realizing something was wrong. Chu Yue had just been driven away, yet now he sent someone to fetch me. He clearly wanted to reclaim my corpse, to frame the grasslands in the eyes of international public opinion. If I go back, I'm afraid not even my bones will remain. Helian Lie snorted coldly and pressed down on my shoulders, a flash of wild paranoia in his eyes.
Tell them. The princess has already died of illness. The one staying here now is my queen. Whoever dares to snatch her will pay with their head.
As soon as she finished speaking, when a whistling stray arrow suddenly pierced through the tent and nailed itself straight into my headboard. A blood-stained note was tied to the end of the arrow. Helian Lie pulled out the blood-splattered note, his expression instantly turning colder than the winter snow. What is written on the paper? Helian Lie clenched his fists and handed the note to me. There was only a single line of wild cursive on it. The last will. The princess takes her own life. The south is deploying its army. That madman Chu Yue. He knows I have no family or friends left, so he didn't even bother keeping me as a hostage. He forged my suicide note back in the south. As long as I die in the grasslands, he can use the excuse of avenging me to rightfully annex this land. I coughed violently, my chest feeling as if it had been struck by a heavy sledgehammer. So, not only was I a mere tool, but I was also a human bomb ready to be detonated at any moment. Using his own sister's life as a pretext for war, the southern imperial family are truly beasts in human skin. Helian Lie turned around abruptly, the scimitar at his waist gleaming with a cold, menacing light. He wanted to charge straight out and hack those hypocritical envoys into mincemeat. Stop. If you kill them now, it will give Chu Yue the perfect excuse to start a war. He is just waiting for you to make a move. Helian Lie stopped in his tracks and turned to look at me, the heartache in his eyes almost melting me. He strode back to the bedside, his broad palm firmly gripping my shoulder, as if afraid I would vanish in the next second.
He wants me to commit suicide. Then I will live just to spite him. Not only will I live, but I will also make the final decree he wrote himself. Nothing more than a scrap of waste paper.
I forced myself to sit up, though my body was extremely weak. My eyes were exceptionally bright and clear. Since Chu Yue thinks I am an orphaned girl who is easy to bully, then I will show him what it means to rise from the ashes. The tent flap was lifted, and the southern envoy walked in, accompanied by an arrogant imperial physician. The envoy offered a fake, shallow bow, but his eyes scanned my face like a venomous snake, searching for signs of death.
Princess, the emperor has decreed, since you cannot adapt to the climate of the grasslands, you should return to the south with this official to be buried.
I leaned into Helian Lie's embrace, feigning a breath as weak as a thread, acting as if I didn't even have the strength to raise my eyes. Helian Lie sat beside me, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword the entire time. That oppressive aura made the air in the main tent freeze.
Physician, hurry and feel the princess's pulse. See if the princess has already.
The physician tremblingly placed his hand on my wrist. A moment later, his expression turned from confident to terrified, and large beads of sweat poured down his forehead.
Though this pulse is weak, the toxin is fading.
What? Are you disappointed to see that I'm not dead? I suddenly sat up and stared coldly at the envoy. Go back and tell Chu Yue that the Qianjin poison he gave me is indeed potent, but unfortunately, the sacred spring of the grasslands can cure all poisons. The suicide note he wanted me to write, I have already revised it for him. Cooperating with me, Helian Lie threw a stack of blood-stained letters right into the envoy's face. These letters were forged by Aurora last night, copying Chu Yue's handwriting. The contents were full of evidence of how Chu Yue conspired with foreign enemies to murder his own biological sister. Take these things and get out. If he dares to take one step forward, I will send copies of these letters to all the vassal states of the southern kingdom, making him this supposedly benevolent ruler, the laughingstock of the entire world. The envoy was scared out of his wits and scrambled out of the tent on all fours. Watching them flee in panic, I let out a long sigh of relief. As my tense nerves relaxed, I collapsed straight into Helian Lie's arms.
Chu Yue.
Feeling Helian Lie's warm tears dripping onto the crook of my neck, I smiled self-deprecatingly. Although I had temporarily saved my life, I had also completely become an archenemy of the southern kingdom. On this vast grassland, except for the man beside me, I truly had no one else to rely on. Ever since we drove the envoy away, my body was like an hourglass scattered by the wind, my vital energy and blood draining away rapidly. The old physician knelt on the ground, not daring to lift his head. The air inside the tent was so cold, it felt like it would freeze.
Khan, the princess's heart vessel is damaged. If we are to prolong her life, we must obtain the 7-leaf snow ginseng. from the peak of the northern snow mountains. But that is a place guarded by wolf packs.
Helian Lie sat by the bedside, looking at my paper white face. His large, calloused hand was trembling now, not daring to touch me with any force, as if terrified that I might shatter like porcelain.
What do wolf packs matter? As long as I can save her, I would storm the gates of hell itself.
I opened my eyes dazedly, just in time to hear these words. With great effort, I reached out and hooked my fingers around his. In this world, I was nothing but rootless duckweed. No one cared about my death. Yet this man of the grasslands was willing to risk his life to save me. Don't go. It is too dangerous. I'm not worth this for you.
Whether it is worth it or not is for me to decide. Chu Yue, you remember this. Without my permission, you cannot even enter the underworld.
He stood up abruptly and threw on his dark fur robe. Amor rushed into the tent, his face filled with anxiety.
A gale has started on the snow mountain. Going up now is suicide.
Helian Lie ignored him, only turning back to take a deep look at me. In his eyes, there lay an obsession and tenderness I had never seen before. He picked up his heavy sword and disappeared into the vast, dark night. I lay on the bed, listening to the howling wind outside the tent. A tear escaped from the corner of my eye. Chu Yue wanted me dead. The southern kingdom wanted me dead. Yet on these wild grasslands of all places, someone is risking his life just so I can live. I didn't dare close my eyes at all during the night, until the first light of dawn broke in the sky. The tent flap was suddenly flung open, and a blast of cold air, reeking of blood, rushed in. Helian Lie had returned. He was covered in blood. His dark fur robe was torn to shreds, and there were several claw marks on his shoulder, so deep his bones were visible. In his hand, he tightly gripped a translucent snow ginseng, as if he were holding the entire world.
You really brought the snow ginseng back. Your hands.
Helian Lie completely ignored his own injuries. He quickly strode to the bedside and handed the snow ginseng to the old physician.
Brew it into medicine, quickly. I'll only say this once. If she doesn't wake up, I will tear down your medical tent.
The old physician practically scrambled away to brew the medicine, looking at Helian Lie's bloody, mangled hands. My heart ached as if it were being slashed by knives. I struggled to sit up, but he gently pushed me back down. Are you out of your mind? For a single herb, you almost threw away your life.
As long as you are alive, I am not out of my mind.
The medicine was soon ready, its bitter aroma filling the tent. Helian Lie personally held the medicine bowl. He first took a sip himself to test the temperature, then carefully fed it into my mouth. His movements were clumsy, yet exceptionally gentle. The snow ginseng truly lived up to its reputation as a sacred herb. As the medicine reached my stomach, I felt a warm current flow through my meridians to my entire body. My once icy cold hands and feet finally regained some warmth. Helian Lie didn't speak. He just stared at me. Just then, the sound of hurried footsteps came from outside the tent. A guard commander rushed in, looking panicked.
Kagan, this is bad. The remnants of the Suo Lun tribe have colluded with the southern ambushers. Taking advantage of your injury, they have surrounded our rear supply camp.
Helian Lie's eyes turned cold. He stood up abruptly, but swayed slightly due to the heavy blood loss. I instinctively grabbed the hem of his robe, a sense of foreboding rising in my heart. This is Chu Yue's strategy to lure the tiger away from the mountain. He knew you would go search for the herb to save me, so he waited for this exact moment. Helian Lie let out a cold laugh and took my hand in his, a wild thirst for battle igniting in his eyes.
They want to take advantage of the chaos. Well, we'll see if they survive to enjoy it. Amor, gather the troops. Today, I will turn the snow on this grassland red.
Battle reports kept flooding in, one after another. The flames from the supply camp lit up the sky. Helian Lie struggled to put on his armor, but the wound on his shoulder instantly burst open, and blood quickly soaked through the white gauze. Blood rapidly soaking through the white bandage. I firmly held down his hand, though I lacked strength. My gaze was even fiercer than his at this moment. This man was truly mad. He was on the verge of death, yet all he thought about was killing enemy. Sister-in-law, if the supplies are gone, our tribes won't survive this winter. I took a deep breath, my mind racing at top speed. Since Chu Yue wanted to play dirty, I would play an even bigger game with him. I turned to look at Helian Lie and spoke, enunciating every word clearly. Helian Lie, give me the military tally. Tonight, I will guard the grassland for you. The tent instantly fell into a dead silence. Helian Lie stared at me, his gaze intense enough to burn right through me. After a long silence, he suddenly let out a low chuckle. He pulled a blood-stained wolf head tally from his robe and pressed it heavily into my palm.
Chu Yue, If you lose, I will capture you back, to be my slave for the rest of your life.
I took the cold tally, but my heart was burning hot. I had Amor gather the remaining elderly and weak soldiers and told him to prepare a large amount of dry grass and empty jars in the stable since they want to seize our provisions. Then I will present them with a grand gift. Watching me command with such composure, the disdain in Helian Lie's eyes completely turned into admiration. He leaned back on the soft couch, the corner of his mouth curving into a wild smirk. At this moment, the remnants of the Suo Lun tribe were using the cover of night to rush frantically toward the opening we had intentionally left. The remnants of the Suo Lun tribe and the southern states' ambushers, like greedy hounds, charged into the rear camp that seemed weakly defended. When they saw the carts loaded with provisions, they cheered frantically. Helian Lie really is about to die. Brothers, take the provisions and slaughter all the women. I stood on the high earthen slope, tightly clutching the wolf head tally in my hand, watching the entire enemy force enter the designated encirclement. I fiercely waved down the red flag in my hand. In an instant, Amor and the others, who were lying in wait in the trenches, shot countless fire arrows. Those so-called provisions were actually entirely filled with oil-soaked dry grass and sulfur. With a loud boom, the entire camp turned into a sea of fire. The enemy soldiers were burned, wailing like ghosts and howling like wolves. The warhorses panicked, trampling one another. This was the empty fort strategy, combined with a fire attack that I had prepared for them.
Sister-in-law, you are amazing. They really did walk right into it.
I looked at the flames, and though my face was still pale, my spine was perfectly straight. Chu Yue wants to see me die, but he forgot that even a cornered rabbit will bite. Moreover, behind this rabbit stands a wolf. The battle ended very quickly. The remnants of the Suo Lun tribe were almost completely wiped out. When I dragged my exhausted body back to the main tent, Helian Lie was sitting at the head of the bed, toyed with a golden hairpin in his hand.
You're back, my princess.
He yanked hard, pulling me into his embrace. The scent of blood on him, mixed with the fragrance of medicinal herbs, gave me an inexplicable sense of security. He leaned down and bit my ear, his voice deep and low.
Half of this grassland is yours now.
Just as I was about to speak, I noticed his face suddenly turn pale, and his entire body slumped heavily against my shoulder. I reached out to feel his back, only to find a short black arrow protruding from it. Helian Lie, what is wrong? Just then, a cold, sinister laugh echoed from outside the tent. I looked up to see a dark figure dressed in Southern Dynasty attire slowly walking in, holding a crossbow in his hand. The dark figure slowly took off his hood, revealing himself to be the Southern envoy who had just fled in panic.
Your Highness, the first prince said that since you refuse to die quietly, then I shall handle it myself. As long as I bring back your head, I will be rewarded with the highest honor in the Southern Dynasty.
He held a specially crafted, powerful crossbow in his hand, the tip of the bolt gleaming with a faint blue light, clearly dipped in highly toxic poison. My whole body was trembling, but I knew that begging for mercy now would only make me die faster. How many benefits did Chu Yue give you? For you to dare to infiltrate the king's tent on the grassland? Do you really think that if you kill us, you can leave this grassland alive? I spoke to distract his attention, while quietly reaching for the dagger at Helian Lie's waist. Although Helian Lie's consciousness was fading, as if sensing danger, he tightly gripped my other hand, trying to hide me behind him.
Once you are dead, the grassland will fall into chaos. When the Southern Dynasty's cavalry flattens this place, who will care about the whereabouts of a dead person? Prepare to die.
He pulled the trigger abruptly, and the bolt sliced through the air, heading straight for my face. At that critical moment, Helian Lie, drawing strength from who knows where, held me tight and rolled over with all his might, using his back to block the arrow. Helian Lie, don't. My eyes filled with fury. Seizing the moment, I drew the dagger and stabbed it into the envoy's chest with all my strength. Perhaps driven by a sudden burst of survival instinct, the blade plunged precisely into his shoulder.
Ah, you wench.
Just as the envoy tried to reload his crossbow, Amor burst through the tent flap with the personal guards. Several heavy swords were instantly pressed against the envoy's neck.
Take him down, chop him to pieces, and feed him to the wolf.
The envoy was dragged away, but the atmosphere inside the tent dropped to freezing point. Helian Lie lay on the bed, his face turned blue and purple, his breathing so faint it was barely audible. The old physician knelt by the bedside, sweating profusely from anxiety.
This arrow was dipped in the soul, shattering powder of the Southern Kingdom. There is no antidote. The Khan won't last more than 6 hours.
I collapsed beside the bed, looking at this man who had risked his life twice to save me. My heart ached so much I could barely breathe. I had only wanted to scrape by and survive in these grasslands, but now, this man had become my sole reliance.
Sister-in-law, the army of the Southern Kingdom is already 10 miles away. But with things as they are now, what should we do?
The generals all turned their gaze toward me, some with suspicion in their eyes, others with faces full of anxiety. I knew if I fell apart at this moment, the grasslands would truly be finished. I wiped away my tears, propped myself against the bedpost, and stood up. What are you crying for? Helian Lie isn't dead yet. Amour, go bring that envoy in. As long as he still has a breath left in him, make him give you the antidote. I turned to look at those hesitant generals and picked up Helian Lie's blood-stained greatsword. Though it was so heavy my arms trembled, I still held it firmly in front of me. Helian Lie was wounded trying to save me. Today, I, Chu Yue, will guard him here. Whoever wants to take advantage of this crisis will have to answer to the sword in my hand first. Awed by my imposing manner, they all fell to their knees. I forced myself to stand strong as I issued a series of orders, reorganizing the camp using modern defensive formations. As the minutes and seconds ticked by, Helian Lie's hand grew colder and colder. Just as I was about to despair, Amour rushed in, clutching a blood-stained vial.
Sister-in-law, I got the antidote.
With trembling hands, I took the vial. Just as I was about to feed it to Helian Lie, the thunderous sound of war drums echoed outside the tent. Chu Yue had personally led an army of 100,000, and they were already at our gates. Feed him the medicine. Amour, ride out with me. I am going to send my dear brother to hell myself. The cold wind howled fiercely, and the southern army of 100,000 formed a dark, imposing mass. Chu Yue sat atop a tall steed, clad in golden armor, looking utterly triumphant. Opposite him, wearing a plain white cloak, I stood on the war chariot, looking frail and delicate. My dear sister, I hear Helian Lie is on his deathbed. If you kneel and beg me now, handing over the seal of the grasslands, I might just let you return to the palace. I gripped the railing of the chariot tightly, my fingertips digging deep into the wood. A dull ache began to throb in my chest again. Every breath felt like a straining bellows. Yet, I still kept my back straight. Chu Yue, you haven't even ascended the throne. Yet you already refer to yourself as emperor. You forged our imperial father's edict and poisoned your own sister. I have already copied these charges 1,000 times and distributed them to the generals behind you. Chu Yue's expression changed slightly. Sure enough, the soldiers behind him began to whisper among themselves. I struck while the iron was hot. I pulled out the blood-stained token of the Southern Kingdom's secret guard from my robes and held it high. Generals and soldiers, is your loyalty to the Southern Kingdom, or to this madman who murdered his kin to seize the throne? Helian Lie is already awake. The cavalry of the grasslands is right behind us. Are you sure you want to be buried with him? Chu Yue flew into a rage, violently waving his command flag in an attempt to force the start of the battle. But right at that moment, a desolate wolf howl echoed from deep within the distant grassland, sending shivers down everyone's spines.
Sister-in-law, look.
Amidst the swirling dust, a black horse charged out like lightning. Although Helian Lie looked pale, and his shoulder was wrapped in thick bandages, he held a heavy sword in his hand, his aura as magnificent as a rainbow, looking like a god of war returning from hell.
Chu Yue, if you want to touch my woman, you must first ask the sword in my hand.
Seeing Helian Lie appear, the army of the Southern Kingdom instantly fell into disarray. Chu Yue was so terrified that he nearly fell off his horse, looking at that tall figure. The anxiety in my heart finally eased a bit, but suddenly, my vision began to turn black. Helian Lie's appearance greatly boosted the morale of the grasslands. The two armies instantly clashed, and the sound of battle shook the heavens. Helian Lie was like a fierce tiger coming down the mountain, charging straight for Chu Yue's central command post.
Stop him. Fire.
A rain of arrows fell from the sky. Standing on the chariot, I forced myself to stay upright, trying not to faint. Using modern flag signals, I commanded the flank cavalry to continuously cut through the formations of the Southern Kingdom's army. Amour, take your men and flank them on the left. Cut off their retreat. Amour took the order and rode off. Flames soared into the sky on the battlefield. I watched Helian Lie fighting in the crowd. Every swing of his sword pulled at my heartstrings. The wound on his shoulder had already torn open. Blood dyed most of his body red. Seeing that the situation was hopeless, Chu Yue unexpectedly took out a black sphere from his bosom and began to laugh maniacally. That was a fire mine, secretly made by the Southern Imperial family. Once detonated, not a blade of grass would survive within 100 meters.
Since I can't have you, then let's die together.
He violently threw the fire mine at Helian Lie. My pupils shrank instantly, and my heart seemed to stop beating. Not knowing where the strength came from in this broken body, I threw myself off the chariot and rushed toward Helian Lie. Helian Lie, With a deafening boom, the blast wave sent me flying. I fell heavily onto the sand, my ears filled with a ringing sound. I struggled to raise my head and saw that amidst the thick smoke, Helian Lie was on one knee, his heavy sword jabbed into the ground, his life or death unknown. Chu Yue fled toward the back of the mountain in the chaos, feeling a sweet taste in my throat. I coughed up a mouthful of fresh blood. Just as my consciousness was fading, I saw an unexpected figure, slowly walking from the direction of Chu Yuan's escape, holding Chu Yuan's severed head in his hand. The man raised his head, revealing a face extremely similar to Helian Lie's but much colder.
Helian Lie, my dear brother, are you satisfied with this show?
The thick smoke gradually dispersed. I clutched my chest and coughed violently. The man holding Chu Yuan's head walked with steady steps. He wore a suit of pitch-black wolfskin armor, half of his face covered by a menacing silver mask. The other half of his face that was revealed looked exactly like Helian Lie's.
Worrigan, didn't you die by falling into the icy lake 3 years ago?
Helian Lie leaned on his heavy sword, trying to stand up, but the impact of the firebomb had worsened his injuries. As soon as he exerted force, he spat out a mouthful of dark blood.
My dear brother, since you aren't dead yet, how could I bear to leave first? For the past 3 years, I hid in the South Country under an assumed name, just to wait for today, to watch you and Chu Yuan destroy each other.
He casually kicked Chu Yuan's head aside like garbage. His sinister gaze swept across the battlefield. When the remaining soldiers of the South Country saw him, they actually put down their weapons one after another, kneeling and shouting, "My lord, so the mastermind behind Chu Yuan has been you all along. You deliberately incited war between the two countries just to reap the benefits of our conflict."
My sister-in-law is indeed clever. That useless prince of the South Country thought I was helping him seize the throne. In truth, I only want this entire grassland. And you.
Worrigan walked toward me step by step. The dripping bloody longsword in his hand made a piercing sound as it dragged on the ground. Amor tried to rush over to protect me, but with a casual wave of Worrigan's hand, several death guards from the South Country instantly pinned him down securely. You want the grassland? That depends on whether the people of the grassland will accept you. You colluded with foreign enemies and slaughtered your own people. The totem of the grassland will not bless a traitor.
Totem. The victor is the totem. Helian Lie is already finished. Now, I am the master of this land.
He suddenly reached out to grab me. Just then, the silent Helian Lie suddenly let out a low roar, with blue veins bulging all over his body. He forcefully shattered the arrow in his shoulder. The heavy sword swept out with thunderous momentum. Helian Lie and Worrigan collided. The long sword and heavy sword struck, sending dazzling sparks flying. Even though he was gravely injured, his desperate, life-risking fighting style made it impossible for Worrigan to get close for a moment.
Madman, do you not even care about your life anymore? Touch my woman, he can try to take my life.
I looked at Helian Lie's tottering figure, my heart aching so much I could hardly breathe. I knew he couldn't hold on much longer. I had to think of something. I looked around, and my eyes fell on the pack of firebombs Chu Yuan had dropped nearby. Amor, find a way to break free and head toward the fire. While signaling to Amor, I forced my weak, ailing body to crawl and stumble toward the firebombs. The pain in my chest brought on a cold sweat, but I gripped my teeth hard. I couldn't collapse now. At that moment, Worrigan ran his sword straight through Helian Lie's abdomen, yet Helian Lie grabbed the blade tightly with his bare hand. Fresh blood gushed through his fingers.
It is over, brother.
Worrigan, look what this is. I held up the pack of firebombs, clutching a torch I had picked up from somewhere. Worrigan's face paled instantly. He knew how powerful they were. Tell your men to release Amor and the guards, or we all go to hell together. Worrigan hesitated. He is a coward who fears death. Otherwise, he wouldn't have hidden in the shadows for 3 years. At the exact moment he lost his focus, Amor violently shoved the guards aside, snatched the fire explosive, and threw it into the distance. Boom! The fire explosive detonated in the open area, and the blast wave knocked Urjin off his feet. Helian Lie seized the opportunity to slit his throat with a single sweep of his sword, putting a definitive end to this traitor of the grasslands. The battle has finally ended. The setting sun dyed the grasslands a bloody red. Helian Lie collapsed into my arms, his breathing so weak, it was almost imperceptible. I held him tightly, my tears falling uncontrollably. Don't sleep, Helian Lie. You promised to show me spring on the grasslands. Just then, a silver-armored cavalry regiment, never seen before, suddenly appeared on the horizon. It turned out to be the long-missing old emperor of the Southern Kingdom. I shielded the severely injured Helian Lie, watching the white-haired elderly leader slowly take off his helmet. That face actually bore a 50% resemblance to mine. Father. You, weren't you put under house arrest by Chu Yue and passed away from illness long ago? The old emperor dismounted from his horse, his steps steady. He looked at the corpses of the southern kingdom soldiers covering the ground, and then at the blood-covered Helian Lie in my arms. A trace of complex emotion flashed in his eyes.
Yue, my good daughter. That beast Chu Yue thought he had poisoned Imperial Me, but he did not know that Imperial Me had already secretly raised this silver armor guard if you had not held this border to the death. Imperial Me probably would not have had the chance to purge the traitorous court officials.
He walked up to me and wanted to reach out to help me up. I subconsciously shrank my hand back, still clutching the corner of Helian Lie's robe tightly. In this dog-eat-dog world, except for Helian Lie, I trust no one. Chu Yue is dead. His accomplice Wurigung has also been brought to justice, since Imperial Father has reclaimed absolute power. Please take your men and leave the grasslands. The old emperor looked at my wary expression, letting out a bitter laugh, and pulled a crystal-clear jade bottle from his robe.
Imperial Me knows you hate Imperial Me? This bottle contains the secret Imperial medicine, the soul-returning pill. It can sustain the pulse and save the life of this Grassland Khan.
Amor quickly stepped forward to take the medicine bottle. The old physician checked it and nodded to me. Only then did I breathe a sigh of relief. After Helian Lie took the medicine, a hint of color finally returned to his face.
Yue, although Chu Yue is dead, the Southern Kingdom is in internal turmoil. Imperial Me is old, and those brothers of yours each harbor their own sinister designs. Imperial Me came this time to take you back to the kingdom to ascend the throne.
I was stunned. Ascend the throne? Make a sickly person like me the empress? Just then, Helian Lie suddenly began to cough violently. He forced his eyes open and tightly gripped my wrist.
She is going nowhere. She is my consort.
The old emperor's eyes grew cold, and the atmosphere instantly became tense and hostile. The generals of both armies placed their hands on their hilted swords, as if a new storm were brewing.
Kagan Helian Lie, Yue is of the legitimate royal bloodline of our southern kingdom. The grasslands are cold and harsh. Her body cannot hold out for long here. Only by returning to the southern kingdom, where the world's finest physicians can tend to her, will she survive.
Finest physicians? Your southern kingdom's physicians only know how to administer poison. On the grasslands, she is a free eagle. If she returns to the southern kingdom, she will just be a canary in your cage.
I watched these two men argue endlessly over me. Yet in my mind, I was planning something else. The southern kingdom and the grasslands had fought for many years, causing unspeakable suffering to the common people. This might be the best opportunity to end the war once and for all. Stop arguing, both of you. Father, I can return to the southern kingdom to take power, but I have one condition. Both of them looked at me at the same time. I took a deep breath and pointed to the boundary line on the map. I want the southern kingdom and the grasslands to maintain peace for all generations and open up trade with each other. I want the horses of these grasslands to be traded for the grain of the southern kingdom and the silk of the southern kingdom to cover this Gobi desert. This is something that has never been done before. If you do not agree, I will stay here on the grasslands and share the fate of the nomads when the silver armored guards face the grassland iron cavalry. Father, how many more years do you think the southern kingdom can last? The old emperor fell silent. He looked at my resolute expression, as if he were truly seeing his daughter for the first time. After a long silence, he let out a long sigh and nodded.
So be it. It shall be as you wish. But you must return with us for your coronation.
Helian Lie gripped my hand tightly, his eyes filled with reluctance to let me go. I squeezed his hand back and whispered in his ear, "Once I settle things in the southern kingdom, I'll come back and farm with you." Just when we thought the dust had settled, Amor suddenly rushed in, panic-stricken, holding a blood-stained secret letter.
Sister-in-law, this is bad. The old ministers of the southern kingdom have colluded with neighboring western Sha. Hearing that you are about to ascend the throne, they've already led troops to cut off father's return route.
My heart skipped a beat. It seemed that this path to becoming empress was destined to be paved with blood. The coalition of rebels in western Xia blocked our way home, their war banners blotting out the sun. The old emperor looked at the dense enemy troops at the pass, his face grim and ashen. I stood on the war chariot as the wind blew my hair. Though my chest still throbbed with pain, my gaze had never been more resolute.
Yue, the enemy outnumbers us several times over and holds the geographical advantage. We fear we cannot protect you this time.
I said nothing, only looking back behind me. Helian Lie sat atop his black horse, though still wrapped in thick bandages. He held his heavy sword in one hand, his eyes burning with a wild desire for battle.
Father-in-law, if you cannot defend the southern kingdom's empire, I can.
Helian Lie and I exchanged a look, understanding each other instantly, using modern demolition principles. I had a Moor lead an elite squad overnight to bury the remaining gunpowder beneath the cliffs on both sides of the pass. The rebels, thinking we were few in number, will surely charge with all their might. Father, have the silver armor guards feign retreat to lure them into the valley. The war drums thundered. Seeing this, the rebel army, as expected, frantically poured into the valley. The very moment the enemy's main force entered the ambush circle, I fiercely waved the command flag. Blow it. With a deafening roar, the mountains collapsed, instantly cutting the enemy's formation in half. Helian Lie let out a long howl, leading the Grassland cavalry, swooping down from the high slopes like the Grim Reaper.
Kill. Leave none alive.
Helian Lie rampaged through the enemy ranks, his heavy sword completely invincible. Standing on the high ground, I watched the man who was carving out a path of blood for me. For the first time, a real sense of peace in the world arose in my heart. The rebel leader was knocked off his horse by Helian Lie's arrow. Seeing that things were going badly, the Western Xia army retreated in miserable defeat. This battle not only cleared the traitors from the emperor's side, but also struck fear into the neighboring countries. 2 years later, under my rule, the southern kingdom enjoyed peace and prosperity. Under the leadership of Khan Helian Lie, the grassland was filled with herds of cattle and sheep. The once barren border had now become the most bustling trade center in the world. I took off my heavy imperial robes and put on a light, red grassland dress. Chire was beside me, helping me do my hair and makeup. Her face was now rosy and healthy, long stripped of the terror from years ago.
Your Majesty the Empress. No, Princess Consort. The Khan has been waiting for you by the sacred spring for a long time.
I smiled and walked out of the tent. My body, which once gasped for breath after walking just 50 meters under Helian Lie's devilish training and nourishment with rare herbs, could now gallop on horseback for dozens of miles. By the sacred spring, Helian Lie was holding the reins of 2 horses, waiting for me. He had shed his wartime ferocity, his eyes so gentle they could melt water. Chu Yue.
You finished reviewing the Southern Kingdom's memorials. When can you stay on the grassland for good to farm with me?
That depends on the Khan's performance. I heard a new batch of crop seeds has arrived from the western regions. I'm planning to test plant them here. Helian Lie burst into laughter. He suddenly pulled me into his arms and lowered his head to plant a kiss on my forehead. The setting sun cast our long shadows across this vast grassland. There was no longer a weak, sickly princess, but only a legend of 2 equals standing side by side. Helian Lie, thank you for giving me a home.
You have it wrong. It was you who gave a future to both the grasslands and the Southern Kingdom. As long as you are here, this world will always be in spring.
In the distance, a Moor was leading the young boys in a horse race, their laughter echoing throughout the entire valley. Leaning against Helian Lie's chest, I looked at this picturesque, prosperous world. Traveling to this era, I once thought I had started life on hell mode, yet I never expected that in these wild grasslands, I would ultimately find my own salvation. Just then, a gentle breeze swept by, and the galsang flowers covering the hills swayed in the wind, as if whispering the tale of this epic romance that transcended borders. But that was easier said than done. I was the eldest daughter of the Yue family.